At this point, I'd like to call up on stage the two participants in our Fireside chat. They're Dr. Richard Sandor, economist, entrepreneur, executive, philanthropist, dubbed by Time magazine as the father of carbon trading. And Tim Profeta, executive in residence at the Nicholas Institute for Energy, Environment, and Sustainability at Duke University and a board member of the Climate Action Reserve. Thank you both.
Thank you, Robin. Welcome, everybody. It is my sort of pleasure and honor to share the stage with you, Richard. I'll also say I'm ashamed to say I'm only fluent in one language, so you're only going to hear English from me. Really, really glad to be here. And having, as a board member and a frequent NACW participant, we usually spend a lot of time in the weeds of the carbon markets here. We talk about permanence and we talk about registry structures and platforms. I wanted, with Richard, we're going to broaden the aperture a bit. I want to really look at the larger phenomenon in carbon markets and carbon pricing with you as somebody who's seen the sort of the lifespan of carbon markets and where they've developed from, really, as Robin said, one of the fathers of the carbon markets. I want to look at the path to this moment in history, we really have one of the best minds to explore this, and then I want to think of the path from here. And in your book, and for everybody, there will be books available, I think, next door afterwards. But Richard has recently published a book called Carbon Hunters: Reflections and Forecasts of Carbon Markets in the 21st Century. That I think is a must-read for everybody in this room, which really contextualize how we come to be in this community working on carbon markets and the path that you've really led on to get us there. In your book, you wrote that Pasteur had said that chance follows only the prepared mind. So as we look forward, and we look forward to how do we continue to grow our ability to address climate and use market-based instruments to do so, I want to sort of ask, how do we prepare our minds to keep hunting carbon via carbon pricing, via carbon markets in the future? We're going to try and do sort of 3 sections of conversation here. I'm going to ask Richard for sort of a few framing thoughts from that prompt. We're going to have a little bit of a fireside chat for a bit. And then just to tell you, in the last 15 minutes or so, we were hoping to be able to draw the expertise and knowledge in this room into our conversation and really ask for audience questions and participation. Richard, welcome. And how do we cast ourselves forward for carbon pricing from here?
I think, first of all, thank you, Tim, for agreeing to the fireside chat with me and Robin and the CAR. It's great to be here. My children, who are now adults, were both born in Berkeley in the 60s, and my wife is here. And so California, is home to a lot of things, including, as you know, the first Earth Day, which happens to be my wife's birthday, April 22nd. So it's a lot of personal things to be here. Markets are, I believe, at the dawn of a great era. And Tim, I say that because I look at it as generational. So the first couple of years, and if we mark the beginning kind of at 2008 as the European Union's ETS, or even 2005 with the pilot program, we have to look at it as a generation. And I look at it in the following way: 0 to 2 years, so let's say 2008 to 2010 is toddlers, infancy, okay? And I look at 2 to 10 years as kind of childhood, teenage years, young adults. So that takes us to 2020. And then I look at 10 to 20 years as young adulthood to being in life, which takes us to 2030. Measuring 08 is kind of the business. So we haven't even hit maturity based upon the history of financial futures, sulfur dioxide, other programs that have worked. So I think that that's the first important thing to say, that that best is yet to come. And that 20-year horizon opens the door for new markets in China, the expansion to aviation in the EU ETS, and even growth in North America. And I think I want to suggest the traders look at this and to cast a bit of reality. So let's take a look, if we can, at something I think you'll find surprising.
Which one am I going to?
Let's go to gold.
Yeah. One more.
We're coming.
There you go.
Okay, so woe is me, the carbon markets are apparently not at their prime here in North America. We're living, as Robin suggested, in a tough time: wars, poverty, famine, recessions, slowdowns, etc. And you would expect, and what has happened is that gold has reached the biggest rally of its life, from $1,000 to $5,000 an ounce. So if any commodity comes out of grief and despair and war, it's gold. Well, then how come the North American carbon markets are bigger than gold as we live today? So if you take a step back and say, whoa, these are pretty brand new. California, you know, kind of in North America, and Reggie before that, and the Chicago Climate Exchange, woe is the carbon market. It is 50% bigger than gold, the go-to commodity in terrible times. So I am very optimistic.
So let me just dig into that a little bit, because I think we're in a little bit of a moment of, there's a strange confluence, I think, between pessimism and optimism right now. In the same conversation, you can talk about, well, let's start here. I think you and I share sort of an intuitive sense that while the road ahead is hazy, carbon markets and carbon pricing probably wins in the end as a societal response to the climate challenge. It's really the best tool in the toolkit. It's economically efficient means of internalizing that externality, as you've often written. And there is an inevitable demand for carbon abatement that is in our future. I don't think we have an option not to, in the end, abate our greenhouse gases once we work through all of our issues as human beings, right? So if that's our inevitable path, there's still yet this sort of feeling of pessimism that overhangs things right now. A lot of it emanating from the real retraction of most of the movement towards decarbonization from the federal government in Washington, D.C. And also the sort of the massive energy demand growth in this country that is now forcing people to consider whether the affordability of power is more important than the sustainability of power, and there's just real tension with what we build out next to satisfy that growth. But then there's an optimistic overlay coming as well. And a lot of it comes internationally. I mean, China has, announced ambitious goals. China, which in one of your charts dwarfs the United States emissions and is now going to be under a mass-based carbon market. India now announcing 2070 goals will be executed through a carbon market regime. Singapore, South Africa, et cetera, all making announcements that are detailed in your book in the past 2 years. The carbon border adjustment mechanism rising in international trade, requiring quantification of carbon. And then the VCM growth, which we just heard about from Robin, that we're seeing, the Reserve and others getting sort of record registrations of credits. So with all that bubbling, how do we square that feeling of optimism and pessimism that I think are sort of coming out of us simultaneously about carbon markets?
Well, I square it in the following way, Tim. I think that the demand for power will generate a supply response. And in this case, a supply of market-based financial instruments to deal with that power. And I think we're seeing it now, even in the voluntary market. I think if you were a customer of NVIDIA, Microsoft, you're not too happy about dealing with young people and saying my carbon footprint is growing at 20% a year and I'm doing nothing about it. I don't think the participants in AI and blockchain and tokenization are blind to the fact that the potential of climate change and not dealing with it carries some serious weight for the planet. And so I think that the people that I speak to, and I've been doing a book tour, as you said, and last week at Harvard and Arizona State, and what's going on in the creative world, whether it is artificial intelligence or drone-based surveillance that could be used for carbon sequestration. And I think of the tools that we had 20 years ago compared to the technology today. We had to literally go out to 15,000 farmers and deal with co-ops and the National Farmers Union to physically see if no-till agriculture was being performed. We had no way to do it and other than to physically inspect it. We had poverty projects in Kerala, India, and we had to have not-for-profits go in to look at anaerobic digesters to see if they were being used and if methane from them was fueling the food creation in these huts, and if young girls were freed from carrying wood to burn inside. Those were things that were observable events. Now with metering and measuring, Tim, I just think that AI promises to be as important, I believe, as the Industrial Revolution, and its role in carbon in generating, and you and I spoke about it, we know that the power in the United States is not being used, just over 50%. What are the efficiencies that can be burned into a utilities mine that's growing at 4 or 5% a year? Now there's huge opportunities to profit from that. And so I think we're going to begin to look at energy efficiency in a very, very different way. And I think we're going to have to look at carbon and power trading in a very different framework now. I was on the board of American Electric Power, which was the largest coal-fired utility, and we were building a transmission line from West Virginia to Virginia. the coal was in West Virginia and the demand was in Virginia, very much like it is today because all of the data centers are being built. I had the responsibility of chairing the finance committee of that utility. That 90 million miles of transmission took 17 years to build, 16 years of regulation approval, and 11 months to build. I don't think that is going to happen again. I think that we will not be in a position. The grid has got to be upgraded. We have got to be able to deal more efficiently. And I think we're going to have reforms in PJM to make it look more like a market and not say this is demand, and instead of demand being what you in this audience want, it comes out as a formula. How do you possibly formulaically set demand for electricity instead of letting the market do it? Mm-hmm. So I think change is in the air.
You've put your finger on hyperscaling data centers and AI as a major factor. And I heard you say 3 ways that AI will have significant effect on carbon markets. One is just the technological revolution of AI can help in terms of just lowering the transaction costs and it takes to do the MMRV on carbon, get it to market, and get it verified. I heard you say that those hyperscalers may decide they want to tell their market, the demand function for their own products, that they are managing their carbon footprint by buying things in the voluntary carbon market. And then I heard, that they may actually then also want to scale clean solutions on site, right? Is that sufficient to keep driving us forward on climate change? Would we end up in the place we need to be if we just had a voluntary market and made sure that Meta and Amazon and Google met their carbon commitments?
Well, I'll try to hit this rather than doing it.
Go hit the red one.
The red one. Okay.
Oh no, you got it. You're advanced.
I want to hit 2 quick slides. Okay?
You go. Yeah.
Okay. This is maybe what Rob Stevens, who I saw last week at Harvard, said is the greatest public experiment on the environment that we've seen. 18 million tons down to 2 million tons. You got rid of acid rain, no fuss, no muss, no effect on jobs. Prices much lower than anybody anticipated. Mm-hmm. And in a time that we thought, oh my God, trading, that's the end of the Western world as we know it. It's an Anglo-Saxon trick, and you can buy your way out of pollution. And it was like 13th century indulgences that Martin Luther, caused the birth of Lutheranism because of the church. Well, this is what happened, and it's nothing. So, and it took a decade or 20 years to really do it. But what I really want to point out is, where's the problem? You asked about the voluntary one. Let's see if I can go here. Next one, I guess. If we look at the problem, 1/3 of the world really uses markets. Elle and I had a chance to be in China a couple of years ago, and we went to Fudan University, and I just saw some gentlemen from China. We then went to Tsinghua, and it was all about markets. And when I was first in China, Robin will find this fun, in 2005, I got to speak to a class at Beijing University. Peking University is what it's called in China. And in Peking University, I spoke through Morris Strong and ultimately through Liz, the School of the Environment at Peking University. And I'm giving a lecture on what is cap and invest and how do you do it. And a woman who I think was maximum 20 years old raises her hand. And she says to me, Professor Sandor, why is the European Union ETS backwardated? And I said, uh-oh, there's something wrong. You don't get a complex financial question about the term structure of carbon prices and what the relative relationship is. I'm telling this story because it's '05, that's 21 years ago. She maybe was 20 years old. There was in 2005 an undergraduate emissions trading club at Peking University. Those club members are now in their 40s. And China is 50% bigger emitter than the European Union and the US combined. I have been going there for 20 years, and we helped establishment. I think you're going to find a huge surprise in China. And I just spoke to Keisheng, and I don't know, they're waltzing out somebody from America talking about markets, and I don't think it's an accident that I'm given a podium to speak about the importance of it. 4 weeks ago, they went from carbon intensity, which is the amount of carbon per unit of production, to actually the flat amount of carbon. That's a distinct stop on the road to a carbon market. We had suggested to them that they should take their advice from the sulfur program, that the simple announcement in 27 or 28, just like with sulfur, will drive carbon emissions down. And given that they've already announced peak carbon in 2030, it would be not strange to me if they made that. It would also fit the growth of interest rate futures, stock index futures, that 20-year timeline that we spoke about, and China would be the perfect maturing cap to start that market at that time. So if we take a look at China and India is now doing PAT program that they do REX. And I do think that even in traveling to China, that the people who are in power now, in their 40s and 50s, have already been primed at the finest universities in China that markets are an optimum way to deal with climate change.
That's, I'm going to leave that slide up because I do, here and elsewhere, we often get very focused on our own country, but you look at the brown slice there of 11%, that's, and you realize how much of the rest of the world is under these regimes and also covering the emissions, the global emissions. But let me pull upon your knowledge as a builder of markets. I mean, you referred to sort of some of the derivatives markets, the options markets. You've got a long history before you came to carbon, building these sorts of markets. At this, what do you call us? Are we in the toddler stage, or we're in the teenager, maybe preteen?
Teenage years.
We're in the teenage years stage. I'm going to actually drop the metaphor because it get dangerous. But like at this point, what are the things that the North American carbon market should be doing to sort of mature the structures and the liquidity and the concepts so that, when we get to adulthood, we have the infrastructure we need, we have the learnings we need to be able to have an efficient and effective carbon market.
Let me kind of answer that in two ways. One, design concept as an overview, and then after the overview and design concept, talk about indexes or benchmarks. So I teach at UChicago, and I use an acronym called SCITED, SCITED. In carbon markets or environmental markets or water, Tim, we create scarcity, okay? That's the S. And scarcity is created by limiting the amount of pollution that any entity can do or some collective. The C inside it is once you introduce scarcity, it requires choice, which we as economists know. How you deal with scarcity is you have to make choices. Then in price mechanism systems in designing, you have to focus as a student of economics or a practitioner in incentives. That's the I. Then you have to be mindful of transactions costs, because we both know that if the cost of trading with somebody exceeds the value that you get from trading, trading doesn't recur. That's David Ricardo. Then you have to deal, in the sulfur program as an example, expectations, right? What is going to be governmental action, and will it change something? What will be market reaction, forecasts of that? Then the D is ultimately the one thing we know, really not much more about economics. It's better to be diversified than not, and that's the D. So if we take a look at that in designing US or North American markets, then I think we'll be guided well. Now, looking at, and I think it's a challenge because we are, and many people in our space, are looking for the perfect offset, the perfect reduction, 100% accuracy. That's not the way the world works. We're not 100% sure that when we get on a plane that it'll arrive. We're 99.9%. You don't need to get it 100% right. And in the Chicago Climate Exchange, we were guided by the perfect can't be the enemy of the good. And as a student of industrial inventive activity in graduate school, my advisor was happy to point out to me that while McDonnell Douglas and a lot of manufacturers of engines were trying to get the top speed of a propeller-driven aircraft, propeller, from up to Mach 1, theoretically it could go no faster than Mach 1, the speed of sound. And they spent all their resources trying to get it from 500 miles an hour to 525. They were going to get this, suck every ounce of it, and the cost of that was horrific. Boeing, on the other hand, said, I don't know what's going to take us there, but let's build an airframe that can go at the speed of sound. And they focused on jet engines and a change in the technology as opposed to grinding out the last bit. this is even more true to Marcus, and I'll finish the last thing. So I arrived in Chicago on May 11th of 1972. I took a sabbatical from UC Berkeley, and I said, oh my God, I'm going to work on redesigning wheat and corn and soybeans and stuff like that. Because I knew something about it, because I had taught it, and I traded it. And I went to, and 73 hit, the Arab oil embargo hit, everything went crazy, food prices scaled, and I said to myself, this is crazy. We ought to start a bread wheat contract. And we were trading cookie wheat, okay? Soft red wheat. And I tried it, and it fell like a dud. I mean, failure, unbelievable. I thought, how could it be that bread wheat exported from the Gulf couldn't beat cookie wheat from Indiana as a world standard? It seemed impossible to me, and I fell into it like a young academic would. Well, I failed again, but being undaunted and being 30 years old, you know, you really were willing to try anything. So I took my hand at gold, and I said, everybody else is really crazy. They're talking about trading 100-ounce bars of gold. And 100-ounce bars of gold is not the world standard. Kilo bars are. And kilo bars are, in effect, 4 nines fine and 2.2 pounds. And the COMEX designed a 100-ounce bar, plus or minus 5 ounce. It kind of shined. It looked like gold. And I said, that can't fail. I've got the best engineered contract. Failure again. The bottom line is the world price of wheat today is a cookie wheat traded in Chicago at a crop of 400 million bushels versus 30 billion of worldwide production. So the Chicago price of wheat that drives the world is based on 1 to 2% of the world's production. You take Chicago price, you add the freight and handling of elevators, barging it down to the Mississippi, the ocean freight to Rotterdam, the rail freight to Hamburg, and you take that and add it to Chicago cookie price, and that's the European price of wheat, based on 1% of the thing. What is the lesson for carbon? You just need to get some homogeneous projects that are good, that are standardized, and Andy and I have talked about it. You can't get into additionality questions. That's like arguing about angels on the top of a pinhead. You need to get a reforestation or an ag methane or simple protocols. They don't have to solve every problem. They just have to be a benchmark that everybody agrees on that's 98% accurate.
The cookie wheat of
cookie
carbon.
wheat. And the same thing happened. I got criticized roundly, Tim, because I get blamed for inventing financial futures. So we started with a treasury bond contract, and we allowed everything to trade. We created a standard, an 8% 20-year bond. There was no 8% 20-year bond. It didn't exist. But I said, it's going to drive a rate, and then let's allow another bond to be delivered that had the same yield as a 15-year 8%, and let's homogenize them. The entire contract was based on a fictional bond, okay, that had 18 billion of deliverable supply. Today, that market still is marginally the biggest market in the world. It is 1 year shy of 50 years of existence, and what was 18 billion in 77 is now 3 trillion in the US. So this sloppy, dirty bond contract, which didn't exist, has provided a hedging ability for the US debt, which has grown, unfortunately, astronomically. All of that, the final line is, Tim, is get a benchmark, make it a self-fulfilling prophecy, get buy-in from people in this audience, from every country and every walk of life, and saying, this is our standard. And if you can't get behind the standard, please leave the room. Okay? And solve one problem at a time.
Do we need a standard for different carbon products? Do we need everybody around one standard for ag methane? Everybody, or do you want to standardize across projects?
I want to standardize 1 or 2 projects, and then I want everybody to do it the way the world bond market works. There's US governments, and if I want AAA, that's 30 basis points below. If I want triple B, it's well below. If I want to trade bankrupt Turkish debt, then I price it relative to US governments. If I want to trade pasta wheat, I trade it relative to cookies. If I want to trade bread wheat, I trade it relative to cookies. Stop trying to solve all of the problems. Center and focus on a benchmark of a limited thing. I always like to say, and don't get disturbed by other goals, okay? Millennium goals, economic justice, income inequality. Because if you solve this problem, the social benefits that will be thrown off, which were key. And the final other quote, which I really like, is Napoleon, when he was going through Austria, had some failures. And he got really miffed, and he said, bring me all my generals. And he brought them all into a room, and he said, at that point there weren't women generals, so he said, gentlemen, when I said take Vienna, I meant take Vienna. I didn't mean Salzburg, I didn't mean the suburbs, I meant Vienna. That was the objective. So I think you need an unambiguous objective with a limited number of policy tools, and not get the objectives multiplying, because if you can't satisfy 3 or 4 at a time, we know the number of policy instruments, degrees of freedom, has to equal the number of social problems. So don't use it to cure poverty, because if we can get our arms around climate change, this is going to be an infinitely better world. We'll have water resources, food security, things like that. So focus, focus, focus.
I'm going to go back to your acronym. The T, transaction costs. In this time of developing and growing voluntary markets in global markets, regulatory markets starting to scale, is another thing we can do to really look at the transaction and see how we can bring the transaction costs down. Like, and what are the best sort of investments and measures to do that?
So when we were doing the climate exchanges, a quick thing, the big problem was twofold. How do you get people to voluntarily cut emissions when there's no law? That's one. The second thing is, can you verify and be sure that they cut what they volunteered to do, and how do you do that? Okay, so 2 quick lessons, and one is what we learned, that you can get people to go ahead and cut emissions if you create what I call a mutual endowment effect. We know that people value things that they own more than they would if they didn't own them. That's Netsch is an economist that speaks about that. But in my career around exchanges and around universities, great ones like Duke, people want to be members of special clubs, okay? And the idea is to build some prestige and mutual goals and objectives with teams. So we did that, and we went around. I visited 100 people. I crawled, I groveled. I said, please cut your emissions. Everybody said, go home, go back to Chicago, smoke dope, you know, do whatever you did. There's no way any major company is going to cut emissions without a federal law. Okay? We managed to get 117 or 100 plus visits in. We got it down to 27. We divided them into ag and forestry and power and industrial manufacturing. We got them to agree to a thing. We picked them carefully. Ford, International Paper, DuPont, American Electric Power leaders, and they all joined the mutual idea, we're going to do something together. We're going to positively affect the world. So we managed to ultimately succeed in that, but one of the big problems was, how do you enforce it, which was your original question. So I called up a woman that I had known for 3 decades by the name of Mary Shapiro. Mary had been head of the CFTC and head of the SEC, and I said, Mary, I have a very unusual question for you. I have a voluntary market, but I got them in the door. It's like the Roche Motel. They're all signed up. They have to cut emissions by 1% a year. But I need teeth. It's voluntary to get in. How do I give them teeth? And I want you to regulate us like you regulate Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan. I want you to do a financial audit and go to Ford's 35 plants, 5 in Canada, 25 here, a couple in Mexico, and take a look at all of the fossil fuel that they've consumed, the gasoline they've bought, and come up with an audit and make sure that they are in compliance in the cut. And the power of the pulpit is very important. Why? Because if you had a company like Ford or AP with 30 billion or 50 billion or 100 billion dollars of market cap, and FINRA, the financial industry self-regulatory organization, starts investigating you, and you end up in the front page of the Wall Street Journal, you lose $5 billion in market capitalization. Your stock goes down $10. So it wasn't the proof, it was the consequences of a respected independent authority. The second thing which we did, and is common in the futures industry, you can't have a fail in the futures industry, because if you do, people are smart. They say, if a failure is going to cost me a $10,000 fine, I go back, I ask my colleagues, how much are we going to make if we fail? And if it's more than $10,000, we fail. Right. And if it's less, we don't. Kind of integrity is a binary 0-1 outcome, right? It's either you've got integrity, you don't. You can't steal a little bit. You have to honor your commitment to deliver the wheat, the bond, or any other physical commodity. So you can't choose a fine amount because you will be gamed. So we did what we call constructive ambiguity. What is constructive ambiguity? If you fail, the price is not listed as $10,000. It is, maybe it's $1, and maybe it's your firstborn, okay? We are gonna have a trial by your peers, and if you violate the contract and they think you did it willfully, we're going to fine you $50 million.
So let me,
If you think it was a clerical error, we'll say, don't do that again, okay? And you're dismissed. So the fact that you don't label a fine prevents failures because you have an ultimate threat by an investigation by FINRA, a trial by Amtrak and Ford and DuPont of your peers saying you willfully destroyed this organization and therefore you will face the ultimate penalty.
I've got one more curiosity from our conversation, and I'm going to we're going to open up for questions from the audience. So you just told the story of the Chicago Climate Exchange and your ability to gather 100 plus. I was struck by like Ford and IP and DuPont, who were the Fortune 50 of the day. And
Right.
Today we have 7 hyperscalers who are sitting up there and actually are driving this economy and driving the demand function. Also, as we talked, driving perhaps investment in sustainability and carbon to keep their commitments. Would it be possible to do a Chicago Climate Exchange?
Yeah.
That is a, I mean, if anybody's here from the hyperscalers, we have to think about your antitrust obligations. I know that, I'm not affiliated with any of them, but if like the hyperscalers gathered and said, rather than us, and what's going on now is they all own their own little decarbonization piece of the market, like Microsoft does CDR and Google does, you know, Fervo, but rather than that, let's pool let's make it a more liquid market for carbon abatement between them. Is there any reason that the CCX concept couldn't work for the moment we're in when we have this massive demand function coming at us and motivate corporate citizens who want to figure out how to manage their carbon footprint?
Yeah, the answer is unambiguously yes. The opportunity has never been bigger. I think the concept we used in Chicago was if you are not at the table, then you're going to be on the menu, right? If you're not at the table, you're going to be the fodder. So the idea was if you could get these companies to start getting rational, coherent boundaries where they're building the mechanism, and you'd say, oh, that's far-fetched. That was really different than in the acid rain program when there was, you know, bipartisanship or even a Republican administration, you know, fostering acid rain programs, things like that. It couldn't happen. But this country is famous for self-standards and self-governance. The New York Stock Exchange began as a club. The Chicago Board of Trade began as a club. The SEC didn't get born until the 30s. All of the governance that was done in building the greatest industrial power of its time in America was done before there was federal regulation. So it's not a pipe dream. What you need is a mutual endowment fund. You need Professor Profeta, you need Carr, you need NVIDIA. You need to get them all together in a room and say, it's either going to be your party or it's going to be the lobbyists. Which do you want? And I think the efficient solution is it should be the party you host, the attendees that you invite, and the way you convene And the way you get design processes and divine committee structures and treat it like a legislative function, except by the affected parties, I think it's not only possible, I think it would be great for the country. And just remember, the United States, with 1% of soft wheat, controls wheat pricing. Just remember that crude oil is measured in dollars, okay? Just remember that when people look at equity markets, they look at the S&P 500, and if you go on Bloomberg tonight, they'll tell you where it closed. You'll see where Japan opens and closes, and then you look at the bond, and you'll say, where's the US 10-year, and then you'll find where every other 10-year. We want to be the benchmark setter, because as the benchmark setter, there are enormous spillover benefits for the economy, for employment, for the things that your president spoke of, the things that if you control that benchmark, you create jobs, you have all kinds of infrastructure, and I think that's ultimately where we want to go, Tim.
All right, let's go for a couple of questions here. And Robin, we're going to have a cookie wheat protocol coming up, but let's go over here to Andy.
Hi, Richard. Andy Ertel from Restoration. First off, I just want to offer some gratitude because all of us here, I remember being at the first carbon or emissions trading conference with you. There was 7 of us in the room 30 years ago. And who would have thought there would be 700,000 people working in this industry, making a difference for the planet. My personal career off the back of some of the markets that you created, but we would not be here and we would not have a chance about solving the climate change issue without your financial work that brought us here. So thank you.
You're here.
So the question, traditionally in the US, you saw environmental markets, the states led. We have a couple $100 billion California market. We have the Northeastern markets. We've got Washington, et cetera. But in the past, we used to see the utilities and the industrial companies say, whoa, too many regulations, too many different things, such so many different markets, and they would force the federal government to move us to a compliance world. And we thought that was happening with, in the Obama administration, and it didn't. But here we are. We've got an administration that's actively hostile to emissions trading, et cetera. Absent just riding out the next 3 years, you're always the eternal optimist. What do you see in terms of what could happen in Washington? Could there be something in terms of we're going to need revenue, right? The EU and California tend to get a lot of revenue off of carbon auctions for their programs. Is this a possibility going forward in terms of, maybe opening some eyes in DC?
Andy, thank you for the kind comments. That's fake news, everybody. Just in perspective. Let me answer that by a quick history lesson. If we took a look at world history and we look at cotton trading, it existed in Mumbai, it existed in Winterthur towards Switzerland, where the cotton was ginned into clothing, into Liverpool, into New Orleans, where it was grown. There were tens of different types of cotton, and it evolved into a cotton structure from self-governance, okay? The USDA actually adopted the Chicago grain standards to become the USDA standards. I don't think, and in my opinion, the focus should be in Washington at all, okay? At all. I think we are seeing it in lots of ways. I think this is a ground-up operation. That Tip O'Neill, all politics is local. If you get California doing what it's doing, and Washington joining, and Reggie joining, and all of a sudden, maybe you pull in North Carolina, and then you flow in and find a offset that a particular state that is Republican has a lot of beneficiaries from sinking carbon, like in Louisiana, into caverns. Focus not on the forward action. Focus on the flanks, the cities, the states. That's where the open-mindedness does, and then the political problem will get solved. When we would go in front of in Congress, we'd take a look at every congressional district, and we'd see how many jobs were created by GE and Mitsubishi and the mining of lime. And those would win under an SO2 cap and trade program. You identify the winners, and it is the job of the private sector and state and local government to establish the standards and ultimately, Andy, for Washington to ratify what has already been established. And so I do think, given the world that we're living in today, I wouldn't be spending time on lobbyists to pass a cap and invest program at the national level. I would be working at how can Nevada make money by joining California? What are the economic forces that are at play there? How do you get New Mexico, which has enormous amounts of potential reforestation and no-till planting, how do you appeal and create revenue for the citizens of different states and build coalitions that basically make people's lives better off by understanding that you can make money from not polluting, okay? You've got to get that message across. Markets allow you to do that. The old standard was, let's pollute and make money. The market solution is, let's show people how to make money by not polluting. That's what price does.
That's great. All right, we've got time for one more question, I think, and then we're going to break. Anybody else? Hands up.
I got to have a few moments to just thank you, Tim, right?
And you have, yes, you do. All right, well, let's move there.
Okay, so the first of all is, I think there's 100 books out there, which I want to thank Battery in Boston for them, and Angelino in Los Angeles for providing the books. All of these conferences, to me, and there's a code at the end of our things, I'm talking about I, and I want you to know it's really we, okay? That Incubex and the guys who are my former people, guys like Andy Ertel who were there, the Intercontinental Exchange who bought, the Jesuits of Santa Clara, Father Francis, a faith-based investor that put $1 million into the Chicago Climate Exchange, the Joyce Foundation, my co-author Paula DePerna, who took a big leap forward and was on the board, president of a board that included Barack Obama. So I just, Neil Eckert, you know, Dan Scarborough is here, all of you. It's their job that did it. It's the companies, it's the mutual endowment, and then on a personal note, having warriors like Tim next to me and having academic support was critical to the success. You are the future of this thing. You are here because you were self-designated carbon hunters. Keep on doing what you're doing. You will be rewarded both psychically and financially by helping to provide a least cost solution to make this a better world. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Richard. All right,
Free
Robin,
books.
what's that?
Free books.
Oh, yes, and free books available next door as long as they last. Thank you all for being here and for allowing us to opine and think in front of you about carbon. Richard, thank you for your time up here and everything you've done.
Thank you.
And I think we're on a networking break until 4:15, so I look forward to meeting many of you out there.